screen. So I'm Mark, I'm presenting, and I know a couple of you, but if you don't just introduce yourselves, so everybody knows who's here. And I guess the question I always like to start with is like, why are you at this presentation? What do you want to learn or get out of it? You want to start?
Sure. So I'm Crystal Lynn Smith. I'm an assistant professor in physics. And I am interested in this, like I said a second ago, I gave a take-home exam to my graduate students last fall after they told me that all their professors were doing that. And so I said, oh, okay, I mean, that's fine. But they were graduate students and there's only 3 of them. I know them all personally, so I felt comfortable with it. I would like to be able to do it because it's also being popular demanded by my undergrads in my big intro class, which not these specific students, but haven't had a perfect track record of academic honesty, especially during COVID exams.
You're very diplomatic.
Yeah, and so I just don't know the best. And with math, like I read a bunch of examples about like how to do take-home exams, but none of them were quantitative examples. So I wasn't sure what to do there.
Okay. Great.
All right, I'm David Sun, Department of Chemistry and Physics. Yeah, so I guess I'm here because I'm
Wait, when are you in physics? That's news to me.
He volunteered. Well, I don't know if he volunteered. Something happened that made him our interim department chair.
I'm chair of physics. So I'm here because I think I'll admit I'm highly skeptical of take-home exams, and academic honesty is a big issue with me. So I'm just curious to see what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Nils Vanenstein. I'm from the ITOM department in the Cox School of Business. I'm here for very similar reasons. I teach a large undergraduate course, juniors and seniors, 150 students. And I've indeed heard about taking on the exams, but that's the one thing that I've never actually went all in on. Like I allow people to collaborate on assignments, on homeworks, everything, but the exams, I typically lose 3 classes a semester, or at least 4, to just do the exam in class. And then even then, like I don't do lockdown browsers because I don't trust that software, but that requires a whole lot of like patrolling. And so it's basically wondering if there's a better method, yes or no. I trust them, but trust but verify, right? So that's kind of why I'm here.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear some skepticism because that's part of what I want to talk about. Here's Derek. Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Would you like to introduce yourself and why you're here?
Derek Coffner, I'm chair of Film Media Arts. Get this far.
Like, I don't want to learn anything, I'm just curious. Okay. Something, David and Neil's previous ones of these, and something I learned in my previous presentation, which ran long as we ran out of time to discuss. So I really worked the past week. I've rehearsed this multiple times. I rehearsed it for my wife the other night. To trim all this down to about 20 minutes because I want to have most of the time for discussion. So I'm going to give kind of like overview of some stuff. I'm going to breeze through some things really quickly that we can come back and talk about more if they're interesting, but I want to make sure we actually have time to discuss things and particularly to maybe develop some things specific to the departments and courses that you're in that I think might be the most useful. Here's our quick agenda. Topics for today. Concerns about take-home exams, which we already heard some of. I want to start kind of acknowledging that. I want to talk a little bit about the benefits. So sort of like if we can figure ways around the concerns, why would you want to bother doing this in the first place? Then kind of big picture strategies. So if you're going to use take-home exams, how you can integrate them in with the rest of your course. And then more detailed things on how to actually design good take-home exam questions. I have some examples of questions, mostly from my own department, which is film, kind of illustrating some of the principles, but I did make up an organic question that might be totally wrong because it's been
But you have a chem background.
25 years since I did it. And I also got one from my wife who teaches anatomy and physiology. So I did want to show this can kind of work outside of sort of arts disciplines. And then most of the time I want to kind of spend on that discussion like I talked about. So this was the actual topic as listed in the CTE website and what I originally proposed, which is take-home exams on teaching tools. But based on conversations at previous ones, and particularly some skepticism about that idea, I thought it might be better to instead make this how to use take-home exams effectively in the first place. I will talk a little bit about the sort of pedagogical teaching aspect of it as part of this. But given the hesitation from people and the skepticism, I think was the word used, I thought it might be better to focus on the kind of bigger picture of using these overall. So let's start with the elephant in the room, which are the concerns about take-home exams. And from previous conversations of these, I heard two big ones. One is students are going to cheat, and that already came up again here. And the second one is they don't work for my subject, and I can't figure out how to use them in my particular discipline. Do you guys have any other like big, huge concerns?
I have a question actually. Are we including in this like,
No, we're not taking questions.
like if students take an exam at home using lockdown browser all at the same time, is that included in this or not really?
So I think you certainly could do that, and that would have one of the benefits, which is to your point, like getting it out of taking up class time. My big picture focus here is on the idea of like, what can you do that's not going to require a lockdown browser, that's not going to require them to all do it at the same time, stuff like that. I think there's different strategies that some of the strategies would work for any of these, but I'm thinking more broadly, like, let's not try to worry about that because
Okay.
my wife has to use Respondus lockdown browser in her classes, and it's a giant headache. Like, not in the classes she's teaching, she teaches a bunch of all online classes. And so this is a big kind of issue because all their exams are now.
Yeah.
And so figure like, it just seems like it's a giant technological headache. So I'm looking for what are ways around that sort of. Although that's obviously an option to do as well. Yeah.
Yeah, my concern mainly is as a consequence of the first point. So I don't really care as much if students cheat because like they were going to cheat and inevitably people are always going to find a way. The key thing I wonder is that I want for them to feel like it's a fair environment. So it's a consequence of the cheating, right? But I want more of them to feel, okay, if there's going to be competition, I don't have a set limited number of A's, but it's mere that I want them to feel, okay, my performance is being evaluated fairly, right? So the ones that are not inclined to cheat, they won't cheat, but then they know that other people are going to cheat, so that kind of issue. So it has to do with the cheating, but it's more the interdynamics that exist with students that, oh, if I don't cheat, I'm going to be falling behind because somebody else has a tool that I'm not using.
Right.
So it's a consequence of that first one.
I think that's related to
Yeah.
this is the idea of you don't want people to feel that they have to cheat to
Yes.
compete in the class.
And mainly that, I mean, they're paying as much for the education, so, I mean, if they wanna sneak the math self out of the education, they feel free to, but it's merely that interpersonal thing that I'm worried about, so it's a consequence.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's still related to this, because you can design an exam that's designed where they kind of can't cheat, or it doesn't matter if they cheat, that removes that.
Yeah.
Okay, any other big concerns about this theoretically? Okay, so we're going to talk about these, and when I get into the strategies, talk about some ways to alleviate or minimize these concerns. I do have the same point you just raised, which is I don't think there's a way to eliminate the possibility of cheating entirely, but I also think take-home exams kind of we unfairly think about, well, if we do that, then they're going to cheat. Like, look, there are students who are cheating on whatever type of exam assignment, anything you do. I was just listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago where they were talking with a college student at a prestigious university in a STEM field who had devised 55 different ways he had managed to cheat in classes and was kind of talking through that. So again, I think for me, it's not about totally minimizing or totally eliminating this possibility. It's putting take-home exams on the same playing field as everything else, where somebody who really wants to cheat is going to find some way. And there's only so much we can do about that. Okay, so I'm going to put those on the back burner just for a second to talk about the sort of advantages side of this, which again is like, why would we want to do this if we can get over these things? So the first one, this was the main topic of my last workshop on effectively using class time. This very limited resource we have is that period of time where you have faculty and all the students together in the room. And I talked about like, what are things you can do to use that time the most effectively? And I mentioned, and this is where I got a lot of skepticism came about take-home exams. That's crazy. Why would you think of that? That to me, like spending an hour, just everyone sitting, staring at their paper, taking an exam is not an effective use of class time if you can find a way to kind of replace that elsewhere. Two, they're less stressful for students. So they get a little more freedom. And again, I'm primarily talking about the idea of this is not a time thing. It's not a lockdown browser or whatever. It's something you go home, they have some period of time to complete it in. They can do it in their own comfortable environment. If they're not a morning person, they can take it at night. If they're a morning person, they can take it in the morning, whatever. And instead of like cramming for like, okay, I have to be at this class at 11 and I have this 40-minute block or whatever to do it. As an instructor, I like that this gives me more freedom in exactly how I design a test. I don't have to worry about this is something that they're going to be able to complete in 30 minutes. There's a practical limit. You can't give them something that take them 6 weeks of full-time work to complete. But a little more flexibility in what you do, which also changes some of the types of questions and stuff you can ask if you don't have to make it so that everyone can get through it. Easier to make desk accommodations. Again, thinking of time limit, if you're doing something in class, I have to make sure even the people who have the time and a half accommodation could do that in class, or I have to arrange some separate time for them to do it. They're doing it at home, they can kind of arrange that time on their own whenever they want, or you just do one with no timer, which is most of my take-home exams. You can give this over a period of time, so you don't have to worry about someone was sick that day, somebody had some emergency and couldn't make it and has to make it up. I normally assign an exam, make it available to them on Canvas, and they'll have 2 to 3 weeks to complete it. If they can't find some block of time in 2 to 3 weeks to do an assignment, there's probably some bigger concern or academic issue going on than the exam. And lastly, this is the one that was originally going to be the primary topic of this. I just think they're a better teaching tool than in-class exams. And when I get to some of the examples, I'll talk about kind of how this works. Okay, so big picture tips, how to think about kind of integrating these into an overall class. And I'll say all of these are not like set in stone. These are more, if you're thinking about dipping your toes into this, if you haven't used them before, some kind of starting points and ways to think about this that I found helpful. I'll also say pretty much every tip I'm going to give you at some point, I've designed a question or used a test in a way that violates them, because there's some good justification for in that point. So these are more like general starting points to thinking about. First off, these tend to work better at things that are dealing with critical reflection, analysis, that sort of thing, rather than just a factual sort of thing. This gets to the sort of cheating aspect. Like if you're giving a geography test and your question is like, what countries border Spain? That's the kind of question that's really easy to just look up and cheat on. And also like the kind of thing that maybe I would say that as a higher educational institution isn't the primary thing I really want to be evaluating is did they memorize A, B, and C? I want to know, can they think about this stuff? I would be very hesitant to run a class where the entire grade for the class was based on some take-home exam. I find these really useful. I use them in almost all my classes as part of a more holistic assessment process. And that could be incorporating projects, homework, other assignments. I have a lot of classes where the bulk of the exam is a take-home, and then there's a short in-class exam we'll do for things that I don't think lend themselves well to a take-home as well. So finding ways to use it for what it's useful for, but not assuming it's a magic silver bullet that you use for everything. I would say this is my own personal preferences, but I'm giving a workshop, so I can say whatever the hell I want. Is I think one of the things that's most useful about these is when you're thinking of them as part of your teaching, part of the pedagogy of the class, rather than thinking of them strictly as an assessment. And that's not to say that they can't also function as that. But when I get to question design, I'll show you some things where I'm doing things where it is as much about teaching and getting them to understand the material as just about strictly assessing did they learn A, B, C, and D. And you can design different portfolios of questions that might do different things than this. One way to minimize cheating is to go ahead and let them use their notes, use their books, use the internet, whatever. And again, you have to design questions with that in mind. So one sure way to fail, I think, at making a take-home exam is take what you would have done as an in-class closed notes exam and just say, we're putting it online. Or take this home and do it at home. I think you do need to actually design the test around the parameters of them doing it at home and thinking about that. I do think you want to be clear about any restrictions you have. So I will say varies a little class to class, but my usual policy is any notes, any books, anything you find online. If you want to go into our labs and like work with equipment or software, all of that is fair game. You're not allowed to talk with the other students in the class about the exam, and you're not allowed to actually post the questions somewhere online and try to get people to answer them. So if you find a forum where someone talks about something that's related, great, use that research, but you can't just post the question and wait for someone to answer it for you. That's my policies. You could vary your own. But this, going back to Neil's point, does eliminate one of the easiest thing, which is if you ask for sort of closed book or respond as lockdown browser or something, and one person follows the rules strictly and somebody else is there on their phone, they're clearly having an advantage. So I want to try to kind of eliminate those. And lastly, tied to that, would use some sort of honor code or policy. I know SMU has an honor code. I know most of the students are probably unaware of it after week 1 of orientation. And this is not a silver bullet. If someone really wants to cheat and doesn't give a shit, they're going to go ahead and cheat. But I think reminding them of it, and I always put the last question on my take-home exam is like, here's what the honor code for this was, and mine involves like, I didn't use any unauthorized aid, I didn't give any aid, I'm not aware of somebody else using unauthorized stuff that I didn't report. And then I also say, like, if you don't feel like you can honestly say this, explain to me why, what happened. And kind of giving them the out so they don't feel like they have to lie and say they did it. And I've had times where, look, I'm sure I've had times where people cheated and just said they didn't. But I also had times where people like said like, no, I can't say this, I was talking with another student and this question came up and I didn't think about it till after, but we were really talking about one of the exam questions. Okay, great, you're letting me know. So for me, this is more about sort of foregrounding it psychologically for them, just reminding them you were saying you're being honest here and hopefully have some shame. Okay, that's on a big picture stuff, getting to specific question tips. Number 1, this goes to the sort of higher level Bloom's taxonomy stuff. And let me move this. Yes. Sorry. So asking questions that may draw on facts information, but they're not just about tell me this fact that you memorized or that you learned. Trying to design questions where they have to know how to use it. And I think particularly in like a math or physics sort of thing, this would be the difference. And this is a very simplistic example, but between like, what is the formula for blank versus like, here's some situation and they have to kind of figure out like, well, I know what formulas I need to use, but then I also have to know how to apply those and things like that. Oops, and I'm on the wrong screen. There we go. This goes along with that. You sort of explain it in your own word of instructions. And I've written questions that literally specifically say like, I know you can just look up the answer to this. I want you to explain it to me in a way that makes me clear that you understand it, not just that you found some dictionary definition. And some of those explanations become very telling about what they do and don't understand. It also becomes very telling when they clearly copied it in some language that they wouldn't understand in the first place. Questions that don't have a single right answer are great. And I'll show you some examples of these, but again, getting away from the sort of right, wrong, and to things where they have to do some sort of analysis or judgment calls. This should be obvious, things that you can't easily type into a search engine. If you type your question into a search engine and the right answer comes up, it's probably not a great take-home open notes exam. As AI is getting better, I think what will work for this is going to sort of shift. But I'll show you some examples of things that I think even with pretty good AI would be pretty tough to even figure out how to type into a search engine. This gets to a conversation Nils and I had a couple of workshops ago about attendance and stuff that happens in class. I love to ask questions that draw on what happened to them personally or things that happen in class rather than things that they can just pick out of any book. And I'll show you some examples of these. And the point here is not as a sort of attendance penalty, like if you didn't attend class, you're not going to know the answer to this question, but more focusing on specific stuff that happened in our class or over the course of this semester or on your own projects or assignments, because that's something they can't easily replicate. I can't go online and type in like, hey, what happened when this person presented their project and we were giving them feedback on it earlier this semester. That's stuff that they have to kind of draw on their own experience. And lastly, this is related to this. The questions that involve critical thinking and stuff are great. I also like to use self-reflection, and I'll say part of that is probably tied to teaching or at school, and that may not be universally applicable everywhere, but I do think there are types of questions you can ask in almost any discipline that get them thinking a little bit about themselves and their own particular answer in a way that would be different from person to person. Again, hard to fake or answer universally. Okay, so that's all of my overview stuff. Let me show you some examples and we'll get to kind of workshop discussion. You guys telling me I'm an idiot, all that sort of thing. Okay, and I broke these just into some categories of sort of types of questions or types of topics you could ask. So since I ended on reflection, I'm going to show some examples of those. This one I use in lots of my production classes. Very much about self-reflection, but what makes this not just sort of like diary entry is I want to know what you learned about yourself, but then tie it to things that happened in this class and tell me how you got to this point. What was some experience that happened that made you learn, oh, actually creatively, I think this way instead of this way. And I mentioned that I like to think of these as pedagogical tools as much as assessment. This is a question that anyone who's done the work in the class should be able to get right, because there's not a right answer. I've had students get this question wrong, meaning they didn't show any sort of reflection, or they just said like something stupid and didn't have any like evidence for it. So I'm still grading it. But the big point for me is not, hey, this is a question that's going to separate the great students from the bad students. It's, I'm going to force you, because this is an exam and students take exams seriously. I'm going to force you to really think about how did you progress as an artist over this semester. And my goal is less about what's their score on this, and that I want them to come out of that exam having done some of that self-reflection. David's still looking skeptically, like we don't do self-reflection.
Yeah, we don't do reflection like that.
We'll get to the next chapter. Man, this is one of my favorites. We were talking about this a few weeks ago. I have a whole series of these I do in our intermediate production class, where they have to talk about things they saw other people using feedback well or badly, and then themselves. This is the hardest version of that question. One of our stated objectives for that class, and we're going to tie these back to your learning objectives, what we're assessing, is learning how to process feedback. I teach film production. It's an artistic process. They get feedback lots of times through the semester. So to think back, what's something where you got a suggestion and you ignored it, and that turned out to be the wrong decision. And then you have to explain why. So I'm asking you to think back on your creative process, look with the benefit of hindsight, what should I maybe have done differently? And why did I make that bad decision so that I can change that and work differently in the future? Again, there's no right answer. I'm looking for some sort of thoughtful analysis. My favorite answer ever to this question, which got full credit, was someone said, I can't answer this because the problem with my process this semester was I took every piece of advice everyone gave me and I ended up with a project that was all over the map because I wasn't trying to pull it in one direction. I was just doing whatever anyone else said. I'm like, that's brilliant. That's a lesson you're going to take and not do that in the future. Love it. Okay. And one more, this is from our intro class. And this one I'm bringing up, again, getting at the idea of going beyond assessment to pedagogy. So the core objective for intro video production class, which is mostly non-majors taking it, they're doing this, their arts elective, is understand what the different areas of filmmaking are, and the idea that how you use the camera and how you use sound and how you use editing helps you tell your story or convey your message a certain way. That's like a core objective. So here it is, looking back at that, like you did a bunch of projects this semester. Tell me something where you made a choice about how you were going to use cinematography and explain how that helps. Pretty straightforward. But get to that core objective. Here's the thing about this. This is on their final take-home exam. They only have one exam. It's on their final exam, which is a take-home, I guess is how I should say that. This for me is not, again, about assessment. The week before I make the exam available, I put this up on the board and say, hey, here's an essay question from our final exam that you guys are all going to have to answer. And we talk about it. And then I go around the room and say, Karen, tell me how you would answer this for yourself. And she would give an answer. And I'd say, that's great. Or like, okay, I understand this, but here's where I don't think that was a good answer. And let's talk about really understanding this. So they've all had a chance to see the question. They've all had a chance to practice answering the question and get my feedback ahead of time. Because I don't really care if they do well on the exam with it. To me, this is, and I explicitly tell them, like, this is the most important thing we should have come out of this semester with. I want you guys to all know this. I'm emphasizing it by showing you ahead of time, putting it on the exam, giving you a chance to practice. So the fact that they know it's on an exam, sadly, makes them take it more seriously. And knowing, oh, this is going to be our final exam essay question, let me make sure I can get that right. Sadly, even after all that, some of them still get it wrong. So there's still an assessment issue involved, but again, I'm thinking about it and using the exam pedagogically and making sure they're learning the stuff that I think is important more than other stuff. Okay, let's get out of reflection, since I know that's maybe my specific artsy thing I like to do. Testing sort of knowledge and understanding stuff. This from a sound design class I teach. This is factual information. here is a mid-session from this session. Tell me what's done right about it. Tell me what's done wrong about it. So this is not a creative artistic question. I'm not asking them like, how should this project be mixed? I'm telling them, look at this technical setup of something and tell me where it's good, tell me where it's bad. But they have to understand, okay, what are all these things? What does routing mean? What is showing up here and what is good and what is bad about it? So it's a factual sort of question. This is the type of thing that's really hard to like put into a search engine, right? They can't upload this picture and say, tell me what's right and wrong with this routing. I don't think probably even if you put this into some picture deciphering AI that it could answer this question well. But it requires them to understand the concepts, to understand the words, and a little bit of analysis to understand like why you route things a particular way or not. Also from the sound design class. Here's a picture of an audio processor. This is something that we put in their software that does something to the audio. Tell me what kind of processor this is and what would it do to the sound. Remember, this is open book, open notes, open lab. I tell them like, hey, if you don't know what this is, which you should by this point in the semester, go into the lab, look around for something that looks like this, put it on the sound and see what it does. Now, cheating is not the right word. I'm making it a little difficult. I'm using a processor that we don't actually have. This is not available to them in the lab. So they're not going to find this exact thing, but they'll find things like it. They should be able to understand, okay, if I'm looking for something that has options like makeup and threshold and ratio and some sort of graph that looks like that, they can find something that looks like that and put it on a sound. So my hope is they already knew it. Again, this is, if you put this into a search engine, it might be able to tell you that's a compressor. It probably wouldn't be able to tell you with those specific settings how it's going to affect the sound, because I'm looking for more detail than just it's a compressor. If you didn't know, that's a compressor, by the way. Here's your audio lesson for that. But the other thing is, again, going back to the pedagogy, they should know this by this point. If they don't, I'm giving them the option, hey, you can learn this. Go in the lab, play around, figure it out. It's going to take them a lot more time to do it that way than if they would have just learned it when they were supposed to. But again, I wouldn't consider that cheating. I would consider that another pedagogical tool, and they're learning and hopefully coming out knowing something they didn't. Okay, here's some questions that combine some sort of factual stuff with a little more analysis. Short version of this is this is a sound project, but it would basically be, here's a video with some of the sound done. Listen to it and analyze what's done well, what's not done well, what needs to happen from here. Again, no right answer. I could give two students the same thing. One of them would think like, man, this could go in this really cool sort of sci-fi direction and would have suggestions for that. The other person could say like, I think this could go in this really good dramatic direction and push it. I don't really care. I care that they can analyze it and give me coherent arguments and notice things that are, oh, actually the Foley doesn't feel like it matches with the space and things like that. So that's sort of big analytic one. This is one, I love this question. And I apologize, the print is pretty small because I was trying to put it on here. This is from my producing class. One of the big things they have to learn there is how to do a film budget. So here's the top sheet of a budget, which is basically the summary for each department, like what their budget is. It doesn't have all the details of how each of those departments break down. Look at this budget and figure out what looks wrong or suspicious about it. And explain why those things look wrong. So think about everything you have to know to do this. You have to understand what all these departments are, what things would be in them, what would be realistic to expect out of those departments in a particular context. In this case, I tell them here's how long the shoot is, unionized, there's no time costs, so that kind of puts some framework or barriers around it. And then they also have to understand how things relate to each other. So, you know, if the music cost is $20,000, is that reasonable? It depends on all the other numbers about it. For some films, that would be really low. For some films, it would be really high. They have to be able to put everything in context and kind of understand them relative to each other and give the explanation for why does this possibly seem wrong. So they have to understand all the stuff about filmmaking, all the stuff how to read a budget, and then analyze, use that and analyze this. Again, I don't know how you would sort of, in any reasonable time frame, put this into a search engine or something like that. I suppose if you wanted to go into our budgeting software and build this entire budget, you could start figuring out things that are wrong, but oh my God, that would be a really inefficient way to do it. And if you built that whole budget, you've learned something about budgeting. So that's a win. And then just to wrap up here, a couple of non-film questions. This is one I got from my wife, who teaches anatomy and physiology. Patient has sustained muscle contractions. Give 2 plausible reasons for this type of muscle contraction process. Explain what step of the process is affected and why it would lead to this. How might we be able to fix this? And her point here, when I talked with her about this, is there's plenty of possible right answers, but she wants to give you something where you understand at least one plausible, or in this case, it's 2 plausible pathways for this. So it's taking knowledge they've had together, but instead of saying like list out the steps of the muscle contraction process. Here's a case study sort of thing. Tell me how we could potentially get here. Here's my possibly completely undoable organic chemistry question. You have 2 unlabeled beakers that each is an ester, ketone, or enamine, and they contain 2 different things. Devise a series of tests that would allow you to figure out which of these is which. List the tests, and I like the idea of extra points for simplicity and clarity of process. I have no idea if this process is doable, but some sort of concept like that, like, okay, I need to understand what these various chemicals are, how they behave differently. And, you know, if you have access to the book, great. I don't remember exactly what the difference between an ester and a ketone is. Let me look that up. Okay, it's this. How do they react differently? Okay, I could start looking up some of the stuff, but I still have to put that together into some sort of practical, logical system and figure out how I would separate these. I have more examples that we can go through if we want, but let's move on to exercise discussion. So what I'd like each of you to do is think of in one of your own classes, some learning objective. This could be big picture, small picture, but something you want them to come out with. And something that is not just, and I'm not using that in a negative sense, but for purposes of our exercise here, just memorization, regurgitation, or applying some formula, something a little higher level that you want them to come out with an understanding of. And I'll give you a second to think of that. And then what I thought we could do is everybody share yours, and let's kind of brainstorm some ideas based on those principles before a question you might come up with that would get at that sort of thing. Okay, so I was like 25 minutes instead of 20, sorry. It was your question.
Well,
So, yeah.
Yeah, I've got one question maybe on the top of it. I really like a lot of the ideas. The only concern I have remaining with is how do you respond to criticism on your grading? So I, for instance, like I let students come one by one with me, and they can take half an hour to look at their exam, and I'll go over every single point, talking why it was wrong. And as long as it's math based, I can tell them and I can explain them, or I can give them partial credit. But everything is quantitative in my field. So, for instance, those type of questions, how do you deal with pushback on your grading?
I mean, you're asking a more general question that we do all the time.
That's true, yeah.
Like a lot of what I teach is subjective. Like forget exams, somebody hands in a film and I say that's a B film.
Yeah.
Like
it's a larger point, but this seems to open up more to that.
So I'd say a couple of things. One is just like with anything, if you can have a clear like rubric or grading scheme, that makes it easier. So for instance,
Yeah, and I saw you have to be a specific example and then also explain how you taught that, or like how the teacher
so you know, like something like this one, right? Like I could say, you know, this part is worth 3 points and describing the effect is worth 7 points. So I can start breaking things down like that. And just say like you did this part right or you did this part wrong. The bigger thing I would say is I actually put on my syllabus, and again, the particular field I'm in, most of what we do is subjective. It's like art is subjective. Pretty much everything we're going to do in this class, there's some subjectivity to, and I'm required to give you grades. So we're going on my subjectivity. If you're not comfortable with that, then you shouldn't be in this class.
Okay.
Right. And that's not to say like students can argue with me about things and I will listen. And sometimes I've been convinced like, oh no, that makes sense. But ultimately it comes down to like, I have this expertise. This thing is subjective, but going off my expertise is this. And I will say use pretty specific grade rubrics like on the intermediate production final projects. Like there's a rubric for how much of their grade is the technical execution of their handwork. How much is whether I think the framing decisions, or, you know, and compositions work with their story. How does the lighting affect their story? So you can like break it down to a lot of parts, but ultimately it is still subjective at some level, and you just have to be okay with that.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's true, partial crediting in general.
That's true, that's a fair answer. I was just wondering, because it opens up that avenue a little bit more than, well, that number is wrong, so.
Yeah, I mean, well, so anything where you're getting beyond like, this is clearly the right answer versus not. You have more possibility for that, but you also have expertise and understanding like, no, well, this is a better answer than this one.
Yeah.
Other questions before we get into? All right, who's got an objective you want to share? David?
Okay, so one of our objectives is that you have to learn how to synthesize molecules.
Okay,
So I think a very simple question to ask is, here's a molecule using the reactions and chemistry we've learned in the semester, design a reasonable synthesis. Like that. There are many possible ways to do that.
I love that.
Can you explain what a synthesizing a molecule is?
Yeah, how to make a molecule from simpler compounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Can you
like,
show like a picture of the molecule?
Yeah, I'll show a picture of the molecule and say, these are the starting materials you have access to.
Mhm.
Using these and the reactions we've learned about, assemble them to make this final molecule.
Mhm.
And there's not necessarily one correct answer.
And it would be something that you haven't ever shown him this molecule
Right.
in class before.
Right.
I like that, and if you wanted to, I love that question, another just variation on it, just brainstorming things. Is you could show them like, here's this molecule, here's a proposed synthesis somebody wanted to do for
What's
it.
wrong with it or something?
What's wrong with
Yeah,
it? Like,
yeah.
what would this work, and if not, why not? I didn't actually think of that until I was presenting this to my wife in practice, and she said like, I noticed you have a lot of questions about like, something's done wrong here, and I'm like, yeah, because those turn out to be good, like thinking, processing sort of things, because instead of coming up from the answer from scratch, like, think about like you're me and you're grading this, actually.
Yeah, and identifying a mistake requires a student to understand, like, they need to know the basics.
Right.
Of that to be able to identify the mistakes.
Because you could look at that series of syntheses and say like, yeah, I think these all make sense if you don't know any better, but if they actually understand like, well, wait, if you do this reaction, you're not going to get this product, which is not going to feed into this next thing.
Right.
Yeah, I was gonna say this one, I actually have a series of things on this exam. I think I do 3 different ones, and they're all actual routing students have turned in earlier in the semester when we're first learning this. And it's like, okay, here's what you guys did earlier in the semester. Tell me what you've learned and tell us that's not right. Great, love it. It is.
Okay, so a big part of the kind of motivation I give to both my grad level and undergrad level classes is that astronomy is basically learning how to read light. That's kind of the goal. It's all we get from astronomical objects is light, and we can't experiment on them. We just have to take what we get and learn how to read it. And the detailed physics that you can get from just the light is really, really cool. So this is something I've done in the lab class for undergrads before, but not as an exam for a take home, which I think is really cool, which is that I give them a spectrum, an observation of the galaxy, and ask them to tell me various things about the galaxy that they notice from the spectrum. And by the end of the class, they should be able to see it and say, this wiggly line. This is a galaxy with a high star formation rate, with lots of young stars, very little dust, and it's likely to be this far away from us and in an environment that's dense with other galaxies rather than not. And that's kind of the goal. So maybe I just need to do what I was doing in the undergrad lab on because I could easily do that at the graduate level, but ask them to from the spectrum, determine, the star formation rate in the galaxy. Well, there's a lot of things you have to sort of measure from the spectrum to do that. And like you said, they can't upload that to the internet, right? So, I mean, does that seem like a good?
Yeah, I have no idea how hard the actual math is on it, but the thing you said, like estimate the star formation rate, that sounds to me like something where they'd first need to be able to interpret stuff out of that spectrum, but then also be able to apply other things they've learned elsewhere about here's how this translates to star formation.
Yeah, so maybe it's even too simple in the way that I phrased it, because you can Google star formation rate indicators or something and probably find, if you're looking in a certain class, you could probably find it. So maybe the idea is what observations would you need to make of this galaxy with what type of telescope to answer the following questions or something? Because that gets you even one step beyond the spectrum, like how did you get the spectrum?
Right.
What was the best way to get this particular, because, you know, if someone says, oh, I would use Hubble, but it's clearly an X-ray spectrum, I mean, you guys don't care, but it's wrong.
Could you give multiple ones? Because
I
if you
could.
give the same one to everybody, then they're probably gonna figure it out.
Oh, there's an idea.
So could you like, I don't know how easily to the eye you can see like, oh, I have different assignments, but if you can like give 3 or 4, I don't know if you can generate them in some sense or.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bazillion galaxies out there, just to pull them off
So,
survey websites.
so my, give them the wrong thing, where my brain immediately goes would be give them a spectrum that couldn't really exist. Like where it would have competing things, like it says, this is a very young galaxy, and very old. I don't know what the competing stuff would be, right? But like, look, you know, and maybe you give them a couple and like, you know, like you said, a couple graphs, and it could be, tell me all the stuff about this. If this could not be a real graph of a galaxy, tell me why.
Well, or
That's
you can
cool.
even let that out and just see if somebody spots it for extra credit. If everybody's confused, like this is old and young at the same time.
I feel like you could do this for chemistry too, right? Like, could you show a configuration and be like, why is this not like a viable molecule?
Absolutely,
Because
absolutely.
I feel like you could draw too many bond lines or something.
Yeah. Certainly do
You
that.
discovered a new element.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking, tying the astronomy into this, I was wondering if there, when I was trying to come up with an organic chemistry question, I was trying to think if there was some question you could ask about, like people speculate about extraterrestrial life might be silicon based.
Mm.
Explain like why, what would be the differences?
Yeah.
Then I'm like, that's something that's too easy to look up. Because people have written on that, but like something like that, like, oh, I changed out this for this, what would happen then? This is the artist in me. The other question I would want to ask on your test is you give them characteristics of a galaxy and say like, draw what the X-ray telescope would show for this.
Mm.
That becomes really hard to grade, like, depending how precise you want them to be, whether, well, you know, if
It's
it's
credit for a squiggly line.
it's supposed to have a peak at this wavelength or something, and it
Right.
clearly doesn't, you
Right.
can grade off that.
Yeah, okay.
Those astrophysicists, they can be like a little artistic too. They can do all this stuff.
Sort of.
Pretty lines.
This guy one,
Yeah, I really like your question about what if you, the introspective one, the reflective one. So the core goal of my class is really to expose non-operations majors to operations management, because the majority of Cox majors are finance, accounting, entrepreneurship, marketing,
Mhm.
management, and very few are actually specialized in ops. And the thing I want to give to the student or tell the student is that no matter what direction you go in, you need a good understanding of ops, because otherwise you're not going to be able to function in an environment. So I was thinking about asking, and I really like the question that you told them ahead that, hey, I'll be asking you this essay question. I've never given an essay question on any of my exams, but to pose them the question of how or what have you taken away from this course in terms of the importance of ops, or like a specific thing that you picked up from, because we touched on like 13 different subjects that could be important for the direction that you want to go in, right? You want to become a marketer, you want to become an accountant. And then just ask, and then what you said there, right? Be specific or something, and then how did you come to that insight? So I'm debating to whether either to do this as a take home, because I've never given even a take home exam like that, or to tell them in the previous class or the class before the final exam, like, hey, this was a question that will be coming up, or something along those lines, because I like that reflection. And that's actually, if there's one goal in my class, I want them to know that. I want them to realize, hey, I might never become an operations manager, but even as a marketeer, knowing why your company functions could be useful. So that's kind of, but I don't know how to put it exactly right.
well, so 2 points to that. First off, something you said like you've never done as a take home. I think most of the principles I went through, I would actually argue are just good exams.
Yes, that was a thing.
Principles in general, right? So I'm not saying they're specific to take home at all. What I would say is some of them become more crucial in take home exam, like the idea of like something that doesn't have a clear right answer, so that they can't just look it up, makes a bigger difference if it's an open notes take home versus they're in class on paper and don't have access notes and stuff. So I think they're more important for that, but I think they're general notes. And the second was, I 100% on board with you. One of the questions I use on the exam in my intro class, which again is mostly non-majors taking it for like their arts elective, is explain something specific we learned in this class that is going to be useful to you in your future career. Tell me what your future career is and tell me how you're going to apply that. And people come up with all sorts of like different things they're thinking about, and sometimes it's related to film, well, I think, or one I've gotten a fair amount is like, I think I'll have to do some sort of PowerPoints, and I got a new understanding of like how to use visuals and not just words to tell my story. Okay.
And how would you grade that, or would you just give everybody a grade?
So and again, thinking about what the sort of purpose of it is, on questions like that, I will often write, 10 points for any reasonable, thoughtful answer. And so that is my judgment of whether it's reasonable or thoughtful. That's actually one I've never gotten pushback on. If I've touched, because I'm pretty lenient, and when I've said like, no, that was not a thoughtful answer, no one's ever said, yes, it was, because they know. Right? Like, are some of them maybe better answers than others, and I give credit to both? Yeah. But again, I'm not using that primarily to separate what's the A student versus B student versus C students. I want you to think about this. One I did in producing in the fall that I really like the idea of, and I think it's one I need to pitch to them ahead of time again and like get them thinking about, was I had, tell me something, some specific action you're going to take based on what you learned in this class to further your career. And the trick was that they kind of make up anything, like it had to be related to the class, but they kind of make up anything and then not do it. I think what I want to do is like pitch that at the beginning of the semester and say, this is going to be a question in the exam. And it's going to be, tell me something you did this semester to further your career based on what we learned.
Do you think there's a benefit to weighing to either giving them it before the exam, right? For instance, so I only have an exam now at the end of the semester. So would you tell them they class before, or would you just kind of quote unquote surprise them on the exam? Because I know like every section is 50 students. I know about 30 that attend every section. They'll have no trouble answering that. 20 that don't come, they will have struggles. So would you tell them ahead of time to give everybody a fair shot?
I mean, on a question like that, I think what I really want them to do is to actually have taken some action, because it's easy to say like, I'm going to do this, and then the end of the semester hits and exams and they immediately block whatever happened the previous semester and they don't move forward on it. I like the idea of telling them at the start.
This will be a question.
And then say, I'm going to ask you something you did this semester. And I still have to figure it out. I couldn't ask them to give some evidence. Like if it's, I contacted this person about this, you have to send me the email, or maybe it's an assignment, maybe it's not an exam. I don't know. I'm figuring it out.
But that's a good.
I'm going to disconnect here in a second so we don't get in trouble, although we can continue the conversation. I did just want to show, because a couple of you were talking about class sections. I cut this out of the shorter version, but I did want to know a couple ideas for if you have a large pool of students, because generally the courses I'm dealing with are like 15 students. And if you have 150 students, there's some different challenges with that. Like you can't do a 30 question detailed essay exam. You'd never get through grading them. I think, probably integrating some multiple choice fill in the blank style question, but things where it's not just, here's a bunch of wrong answers and a right answer, but really about like, what's the best answer? And the one that came to mind in my head that I've used in my class is has to do with audio settings in the sound design class. And I said, of these choices, what would be the best settings for this type of project? And all the settings are actually things they could set and all things that would work, but some are better than the others based on things learned. This one, if you're using like doing this on Canvas, you can do pretty easily. If you develop a larger pool of questions, I shouldn't say that's easy, that takes more work, obviously. But then students can get different subsets of things. So not everyone's getting all the same questions. You probably only used that before. I don't generally like time limits, but you can put in a time limit, particularly if you are asking things that are more factual that they could look up. If they don't have time to look them all up, then that helps. Then lastly, this I kind of use some of this anyway, but I think particularly with a larger class, this might just be more necessary, is have some sort of traditional in-class closed notes, actual questions that you can grade through quickly, and then figure out what are like the 2 or 3 really important things that I want to give them more time to think about, or do in more of an essay format instead of grading a whole slew of questions. So there's just a couple ideas. I'm gonna disconnect so that whoever comes in after here, who starts yelling at me doesn't.